So good afternoon and welcome to this e-Memoir session, planning and delivering level 2 study programmes in the new further education and skills environment. This session is going to be led by Beej Kaczmarczyk, and as ever we like to keep our webinars and meetings as interactive as possible, so feel free to use the question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this session. You don't have to wait until the end for any questions. I say just keep the session as lively as possible by keeping the questions and thoughts coming. You'll all be receiving a copy of the video recording and slides, and if you're watching this on a video recording and you have any questions, our contact details will be available at the end, and again we'd encourage you to get in touch. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Beej. Thanks a lot, Beej.
Thanks very much, Marek. And yeah, it's just afternoon, so good afternoon to our subscribers and customers who have joined us on planning and delivering level 2 study programs in a new FE and skills environment. As Marek says, happy to take questions as we go along, comments, whatever. All our slides will be obviously available to you after the webinar as well as the recording. And if we can't answer your questions in the course of this next hour or so, we'll try our best to get back to you later. So my start point really is I suppose the new environment has to be take account of the fact that what was in the pipeline for additional funding for 16 to 19 study programs had already been announced well ahead of the COVID-19 and the lockdown. So these headlines basically you'll be familiar with. The additional funding that would have gone into study programs in England, £400 million shared across all the different range of providers. And this was going to be split basically between an increase in the base rate and changes to programs which had a higher cost weighting, or what we call high value subjects, which would be important in terms of a more productive and higher productivity rate, such as engineering, construction, etc. The basics of the funding methodology have been retained, and I want to pick through that because that's quite important for determining the viability of your provision. But I think the other, the main driver here was that almost half of that was going into an increased funding rate. So the £4,000 would become 4,188 and pro rata for any part-time learners. Now that's after several years of the money value staying at 4,000 and therefore a real terms fall. And one of the big issues I think this is raising for you if you're planning level 2 programs, or any program actually within study programs, is have the changes in funding, which is partly the change in the base rate, and then the difference in cost weightings for subjects such as engineering, construction, catering, transport, operations, as well as what's been added to high value subjects, which of course these are predominantly level 3, whether that's made a significant difference. Now, between 4.7% increase and possibly 7% increase in the rate of funding for some of your individual 16, 17 and 18-year-olds is, I suppose, to some extent redressing the problems we've had in falling real rates of funding for your learners. There's also been additional funding for maths and English on level 3 programs. So again, any learner that's not yet achieved grade 4 to 9 English and maths on study programs, who's on a level 3 program, would be getting additional funding, which was matched to the funding that was going to be available for T-level learners. The tolerance for those learners that, or that proportion of your learners who are not doing English and maths, who should be doing, that's been retained. And then there was some little bits of funding for retention of teachers and leaders in the sector. And of course, the continuation of the support funding for T-levels in terms of finding quality work placements, industry placements, as well as obviously the early adapters. So you can see that before COVID, the new environment already had that, between 4.8 and 7% increase in the rate of funding for individual learners. Now, the other, of course, big impact that's starting to work its way through would be in many parts of the country, there's now an increased number of learners who are leaving Key Stage 4, and so that would also in some of your organizations meant that through the lag number effect you've either had an increase already or expected to see an increase in your allocation next year. So the first question really to take away from this is, even without knowing anything about what happened during COVID or any of the actions in terms of COVID-19 skills packages, is that in your organization, how you've taken advantage of these changes? Was that now, for example, being reflected in the viability of level 2 programs? So if you had a level 2 program where you might have had 14 or 15 learners who became starts on that, and say that was in engineering or construction, because of the increase in the base rate, as well as the change in the program cost weighting, then you might find that now that number would be not only viable, but generating some kind of surplus, or where it was previously you needed 15 to break even, you might now only need 14 learners. So that's one of the first things I think it's useful for you to reflect on in your own organization, is that before any of the other changes in funding, were those that already were forecast, were they making a material difference, or were you still trying to catch up? So even with the 6 to 7% increase in the overall funding per learner, were you actually still finding that that wasn't enough? And that was particularly important for the viability of certain programs, which had always indicated that things like program weightings were not appropriate, whatever. So that would have particularly affected your level 2 programs in things like catering, hospitality, hair, beauty, engineering, construction, transport, etc. So I think with at the same time, additional funding was being put into the post-16 system that was reflecting the money that was needed to encourage you to put and find more quality work placements or industry placements. And that's not just for T levels, that's across the piece. So there's been some increased funding there. The advanced maths medium for those learners that obviously were studying a level 3 maths in addition to any numbers you had in the past. The level 3 program maths and English, which I've already covered, and also the early adopter fund, which obviously was there for those of you who are going to deliver T levels in future. But I think if you look across that additional investment, other than what might be some additional funding to support finding, high quality placements for all of your learners on study programs, not just T levels, that therefore would include level 3 and level 2 and below, is that was very, very little specifically for level 2 and below programs. I think therefore that's disappointing, but you can see at the same time that the emphasis with the changes in qualifications has been very much around level 3. So what happened, obviously, we then have the COVID-19, we have the lockdown, and the lockdown essentially made sure that during the remainder of 1920, if you were a grant funded provider of study programs, you would have had in effect a fairly secure level of funding allocated to you through the ESFA. That was profile payments, and that would have been done. But that made some assumptions about continuing to support people on a study program. Now, obviously, we've had, we're now into 2021. We knew that by the end of March, April, we were given our allocations for the next year. And you know that those allocations, to some extent, reflect that continuity of support, which comes to grant funded providers. So if you're a college, a school, or a local authority provider, it's not so secure for those of you who are on contract, where other forms of support, such as provider relief, etc., have been important. Now, that's been continuously updated, and that's been continuously updated. But what it's reflecting now is that because of the implications of that support that was available till the end of the first lockdown was I suppose based on some key expectations. So irrespective of whether the person was a level 2 or a level 3 or whatever, that you would continue to employ the staff providing the level 2 programs as part of study programs on the current contracts. You wouldn't have furloughed the relevant staff because in effect the support was going to be continuous through that first lockdown and beyond, and that would mean that those learners would be supported the completion of their programs. So if it was a level 2 program, they would be supported. Now that would include the final assessments. However those assessments were done, we know what happened in terms of external assessments and exams at the end of last academic year. But there was also an expectation that if a study program was being offered to a key worker's children or to a vulnerable young person, they would be continuing in some form or other. And I know that many of you continued to open for those learners as well as provide the online support for them. because the major emphasis would be on taking quite a lot of the face-to-face learning for large numbers of our study program students online, that would ensure that there was the assumption that there would be suitable arrangements to make sure those learners could continue their programs. So online tutoring, webinars, e-learning, remote learning, remote support through tutorial, and obviously that would take account of things like safeguarding, etc. But also, and this is something I was reflecting on a meeting with students this morning as a governor, was that there would be an expectation that where those learners were digitally poor, didn't have access to, for example, suitable devices like iPads, etc., that you would make some kind of provision for them, either using what was left in terms of your unspent bursary fund, or getting some additional funding if we could from other sources such as the LEP, ESFA, or any other. We for example, were getting some from charities. And of course, any of those learners who were continuing in the programs, whether they were face-to-face or through remote learning, an expectation that there would still be additional learning support. A lot of that to do with emotional support, help with mental health issues, as well as other social issues that might have been raised, as well as continuing to supply learner support. And of course, we know what the issues were around free meals. So if you start thinking, reflecting on your own organization up until the end of that first period of lockdown, you've got a lot of experience of applying the support for learners during the COVID crisis, and this would have applied to your level 2 programs just as much. Now, there might have been issues that this might have raised for you. How resilient were your level 2 learners in terms of being able to cope with remote learning? Our level 3s, who were already used to having a proportion of the program delivered online, actually, they were fairly resilient, but individuals still had problems, particularly those that felt left behind, those who couldn't cope with remote, those who didn't have access to the support mechanisms, those who needed social support with social issues. But for a lot of our level 2s, although a fair number were able to take advantage of the remote learning and online learning, I think we also had issues for them, and particularly issues for those learners who are operating at below level 2, entry level 1, who needed a lot of that face-to-face support, as well as obviously often with additional learning needs. So you can see that the ability to put on in that new context is now different, because we know that COVID is here. We're into our second lockdown. And if you start looking at the expectations of support now, but because many of our learners are now back in our institutions, whether it be a college, a training provider, local authority, you've now got lots of 16 to 19 learners coming in. They've got a mix of face-to-face and also remote. So again, the expectation from the funding agency, since they're giving us the profile payments for our study program learners, is that we'll continue to deliver as many hours as we would have normally given them. And that would mean that, for example, from the audit point of view, the way you deliver the hours, if it's a 600-hour program, what proportion of the 600 hours are face-to-face, what proportion is online or blended, and how do you evidence that through things like log-ons, through webinars, through online tutoring, etc., as well as recording the activities of learners when they submit work or are involved in discussions or in forums, whatever. So that raises some interesting issues, but it also, we're assuming that there is, wherever possible, some blended form of learning. Now, it can't be an arbitrary 50-50. That just doesn't work. It's got to be tailored for individual learners. So some of our level 2s might have 50-50. Others might have 60% face-to-face, 40%. The key test of an effective study program at level 2 is that this is tailored to meet the needs of individuals. And I think the one thing we've learned from COVID, a couple of good things, despite all the less good, is that this has really got us to focus on tailoring a program very much around the individual and their individual circumstances, as well as obviously, seeing a greater benefits of investing in blended learning. But I think that the assumptions are that all the way through is we're not just doing the initial assessment. The assumption built into this is are you continuously assessing knowledge of our learners during this startup term, and I think beyond, because we will be identifying gaps in their knowledge and skills on a level 2 program because they maybe have understood fully a bit of remote learning or a webinar, or they just haven't been able to access the tutors on the basis that they, perhaps needed in the past. So that I think that there is one key emphasis in cost effectiveness, and I'm not talking about just the efficiency indicators, but the effectiveness indicators for our study programs in terms of making sure that learners stay on program and are retaining and progressing to the best of their ability. And therefore, we're doing a lot more in terms of formative assessment, not just initial assessment, as well as putting in place the additional support for those that are vulnerable, disadvantaged, where, for example, they might need support to access any remote learning, for example, with equipment as well as extra tutoring. And at the same time, obviously a constant regard to safeguarding. So you can see now that that new environment at the moment puts even more pressure on us having planned and delivered an effective study program, including a level 2 study program, which of course is often a one-year program which has got a clear line of sight. And that's one of the things that I want to raise with you. Much greater emphasis, as you'll see, because of the review of level 3 and below qualifications. Now, what the Chancellor announced in September is obviously with the major issues facing us coming out of lockdown, but also into a much different world in terms of employment, furlough, etc. A great emphasis was going to be placed on giving people who were disadvantaged in the labour market, unemployed, or at threat of unemployment, or after a long period of furlough, help with them to obviously secure employment. So the Kickstart scheme, which by the way is available for 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, anyone on universal credit or at risk of long-term unemployment, is very much there about ensuring that they get high quality industry placements, leading hopefully to employment. And that's obviously paying a wage subsidy to the actual employer. The hiring of new apprentices at level 2 and 3 does apply also, but it's obviously not part of study programs, and there are incentive payments for employers for young apprentices and for adults. Now, what has got impact on level 2 study programs is the investment of £111 million this year in high quality traineeships. That's an expectation of about 30,000 more trainees following those programs, and that would be a mix of 16 to 18 and 19 to 24. And at the same time, the other thing which affects study programs at level 2 is what we call the high value courses for school and college leavers aged 19. There's a separate but similar scheme for those that are aged 19, but that's not funded from study program funding from the SFA, that's funded from the adult education budget. So there are therefore some of these measures, such as the traineeship measure and the high value courses for school and college leavers aged 18. So again, one of the questions is, are you thinking about investing in traineeships as part of a study program? And that would often be at level 2. Of course, now you can offer it to level 3 learners as well, which is one of the new flexibilities. But also, might there be learners who have completed study programs who are 18 who just haven't got a job, haven't got an apprenticeship, who might need a 1-year intensive level 2 or level 3 program in what we call the high value sectors, the sectors where there are likely to be employment opportunities, health and social care, construction, engineering, renewable energies. So you can see that that's all giving us a little bit of a different context in terms of the FE and skills sector for study programs at level 2, but also to recognize that there is some funding that's been made available to help those learners, particularly those learners on 1-year programs who have had trouble keeping up with their studies, etc. So there's catch-up funding, which of course was announced for the sector, and that's roughly £96 million, but that's only a one-off fund for this year. And of course, that critically is there to support those learners who have had the biggest disruption to the learning because of the coronavirus crisis, and clearly that's going to continue. And it's essentially there to give you small group tuition support for students aged 16 to 19. It's not just in English and maths. It's using as a proxy those that yet haven't achieved level 4 to 9 in English and maths at GCSE, but it's also for other courses where learning's been disrupted. And here it's basically £150. Whether it's enough or not, I think it's at least in the right direction for full-time students who haven't got English and maths. So therefore it's based on your data that you submitted for in arrow 4. I think it's, but yeah, that's arrow 4. But I think it's what it's trying to take account of is that if we know that those learners haven't got the English and maths, then obviously that's going to be an obstacle, and that needs to be given more support. So it is there. I think a lot of it will be directed towards, sorry, forget what I said about arrow 4, that's something else, I'm thinking about something else, is that is there to help those learners that clearly your data already shows haven't got English and maths, and that's based on previous ILR data. So, but the one thing about this is, you can accept or decline the extra funding. So you have to opt into the system. And there's some wonderful examples that we've seen of how different institutions have used it to support the learners, including, of course, level 2 learners, small group tutoring sessions, giving them more English and maths interventions in different forms, as well as obviously investing in the pastoral learning support. Can I just ask, by the way, from those of you listening in, if you have or you're planning to access the catch-up funding, the small group tuition, how are you intending to use that with, for example, your level 2 study program students? Any thoughts?
Yeah, feel free to use the chat facility again at any point throughout the duration. So if you'd like to respond there. And also, with the size of the group today, I was just thinking as well, Beej, if anyone feels that there's anything they'd like to perhaps use the microphone for, I can unmute it for you. Just let me know by indicating again in the chat facility, and I'll do that. Thanks all. Thanks, Beej.
Yeah, thanks very much. Enough. One of you is mostly for English and maths. Okay, that's a response, and we would expect that as well, because a lot of the catch-up would be in those areas of English and maths, which are stopping them, for example, performance well on the rest of the program. You've got a little, bringing in mentors, mentors to work with your learners, particularly those that have found online learning most difficult. Yeah, so some good examples there. Thanks very much. So English and maths. What do you call it? Learning mentors. Yeah, so that's some good examples. Thank you for that. Now, the other big driver, and I think this is something you've got to really take account of, because it's going to be very important in the design and delivery of your future level 2 programs, is the review of qualifications, post-16 qualifications at level 3 and below. Now, the intent there is that very much about focusing on level 3 qualifications, that T levels and A levels should be, if you want, in most cases, the primary choice for learners in future. And that first stage is now concluded. Now, the DFE has agreed that a small range of other qualifications, where T levels and A levels are not most appropriate, would still, of course, be eligible to be funded. But what it's now doing is extending its in a second stage, the call for evidence on level 2 and below. And I think that is very important, because if you are providing study programs at level 2 and below, and in the case of the college I'm associated with, that could be almost half of our learners on study programs. But at the same time, it's the direction of travel in terms of removing funding from certain qualifications will continue. And that will happen. It happened in August of this year, and it will obviously continue with no qualifications with no enrollments, as well as qualifications with low enrollments, which might impact on what you're offering in terms of a level 2 program. In other words, the core learning aim could be a qualification which in future is not eligible to be funded. So that second stage consultation is opened up and will continue to the 15th. And I think what is important there is, and this is a key line, that if you think about the planning and delivery of your level 2 study programs, which are usually 1-year full-time programs, although they can be part-time if they take the form of a pre-apprenticeship or traineeship, is that the line that's most important is all programs and qualifications at these levels, it's level 2, should have clear purposes. So what is the purpose? Is it to go on to further study? Is it employment? Is it an apprenticeship? Is it independence? The target cohort is carefully identified through the initial advice and guidance, the matching process, and then the clarity of those progression routes is there all the time. And that is going to be very critical for which of your level 2 study programs will continue to be funded. So there's about 8,000 level 2 and below qualifications that would be subject to this change. But there's also some interesting DFE data, which I think we need to have another narrative about. You know, it says that 60% of students who study, who are 16, who study a classroom-based level 2 course do not move on to study at level 3 the following year. Well, they might be moving, of course, on to apprenticeships or redirecting themselves to another level T program, or maybe going straight into employment. So there could be other positives as well. But there is one characteristic, 37%, this is DFE data, who leave education with level 2 qualification find it harder to get a job, compared to 14% of students who leave with a level 3 qualification. However, of course, that might be very different in the post-COVID world, where I think a lot of learners who are leaving with level 3 might also find it difficult to get a job. But that means that, you know, that there are a fair number who do find it, that the level 3 does help them. But I suppose the level 2 program supports them. But that means that, you know, well over a third don't find that the case. Now, there could be other reasons for that. But however, I think these are some key messages. I think some early solutions in the review already look like removing funding from some level 2 qualifications, for example, ICT functional skills. But I think what's also important is that in terms of your future planning and delivery of level 2 programs is to understand that I think there'll be an increased focus on what we call transition programs. In other words, the level 2 program is a transition which primary for purpose for some learners, remember it's going to be tailored, is going to be progression to level 3, and that will be similar to what we call the preparatory T levels transition program, which I know some of you have already opted into and are involved in. But I think what is going to be clear, that if the DFE review goes the same way as it has done with level 3, that they'll be more prescriptive about the pathways that lead to employment with a direct line of sight to occupational standards. So if your level 2 study program isn't lined up to either a level 3 progression qualification wise, full time, or to employment, including an apprenticeship, then it's going to be very difficult for that to be sustainable in future. But not to forget that there are other motives for doing a level 2 program, which could be a pathway to independence or a pathway to, you know, working in a different sector, because you might be using the level 2 to redirect yourself into a different sector, which might happen if you're an 18-year-old whose current level 3s are not suitable for the labour market. If you've not seen the T level transition program, I know some of you might be involved in it, then this is basically directed itself in developing the skills, experience, and knowledge and behaviors for progression onto a T level, which of course is at level 3. And basically it's targeted those learners who are 16, 17, because they've obviously got to be able to start the T level as soon as they can at level 3 for its continued funding under the ESFA, who are not yet ready to start a T level, but have the potential. So there's a lot of issues here about the information, advice, and guidance, the initial assessment. That is already being implemented, and I know that some colleges and training providers, essentially it takes the form of these 5 key components. Now, I'm not trying to influence you to get involved in a transition program, but if I was looking at the future of level 2 study programs, I would be thinking maybe we should be mirroring some of these things, you know, and I don't think that would be too difficult. If you look at the 5 components, key components: diagnostic guidance, period, English and maths, work experience and preparation, or professional placement as we call it, the introductory technical skills. Now that's the line of sight either with a level 3 qualification or an occupational standard, and then the wrap round pastoral support and personal development. Now these would be funded as part of the study program, so an average of 600 hours, a minimum of 540 if you want them to be a full-time learner if they're 16 and 17. So can I just ask, by the way, from any of you participating today, are any of you involved in the T level transition program at level 2? Can we just see if there's a show of hands there? Not as such, no. Nope. Okay, but that's something to think about, because that model, and have a look at it, is going to be useful for the evidence collection of the value of level 2 study programs. And I think, therefore, when you start looking at the way the formula works, remember the funding formula basically stays the same. We've had 2 new additions, the level 3 program. That's only for those learners in level 3 who haven't yet got English and maths. The high value courses premium, which is predominantly these level 3 programs in key sectors. But you can see that the key driver is still the number of learners and the funding rate for those learners. So the funding formula itself doesn't change, but quite a lot of impacts there. I mean, for example, has COVID-19 led to an increase in the number of 16 to 18-year-olds that you've got now? And maybe that is giving you some difficulties in the fact that the funding is lagged. Has COVID meant that retention in some programs at level 2, you've retained fewer learners, that more have dropped off? Have you now got some less disadvantaged funding because more of them passed English and maths through teacher assessment, and yet you might find there are problems there? Then there's obviously, there's the other issues like not finding work placements. We might need more capacity and delivery funding. Student support might have changed because we've got learners with more hardship issues, etc., as well as you might find that there are more learners with individual needs. So all of these could be impacted when you're looking at 2020-21, but also 2021-22. So currently, for any of your study program learners on a level 2 program, this is the rate of funding before you take account the program weightings, the disadvantage uplift, etc. It's your baseline funding. And of course, some of these learners, if they're in engineering construction, you apply a 1.3 multiple to these funding rates, or a 1.4, depending on the sector subject area. But essentially, you can see that the majority of your level 2s will be full-time, so they'll be earning you 4,188. The others, who might be on traineeships, will be part-time. But there is one of you has asked me a question. What happens if you put on a level 2 offer after Christmas that isn't full-time? Well, if it's not full-time and the planned end date is, say, still June or July, then if it's below 540 hours, it will be one of the bands below. So you'll be earning either 3,455 for each completer or 2,827, depending on the total number of hours. If you're planning to do it as a full-time program, but over 2 academic periods, so in other words, they might start in a new year and go through until next September, October. In effect, you're covering 2 academic years. There'll be part-time in 1 year and part-time in the second year. But obviously that's going to be the case with increased flexibility in the delivery of level 2 programs, particularly in response to changes in the labour market. So I think that's a good point you've raised. Thank you for the question. Hopefully that answers it. So when you're planning your level 2 study programs, if you already take account of all the factors I've brought in, such as the review of qualifications, what's happening during lockdown, and the ongoing support, I think it becomes clear that in planning a level 2 study program, it's very much about getting the purpose clear. For that individual, we have to tailor it to know, in terms of their career education, information, advice and guidance, what route are you wanting to take? What pathway are you in terms of your transition from Key Stage 4? What is your ultimate destination at the end of this year or this period of time? And built into that, obviously, is the initial assessment and induction. So you could have an aspirational pathway. I want to do my level 2 so as I can progress to a level 3 T level or another level 3 program, or employment or apprenticeships. And we need to know that for each individual learner. And that might change in the course of the year, which often will do with a 16 or 17-year-old. But then if you want the meat in the sandwich, or the filling in the sandwich, is the actual study program, because the study program will then have a holistic approach, which is what technical things do we need to do, what GCSEs, what technical certificates, what diplomas do you need, what English and maths do you need, what qualification, non-qualification hours in terms of tutorial, industry placement, what do we need in terms of developing your personally, in terms of that, as well as your behavior and attitudes. And then obviously the teaching, learning and assessment, including blended learning to meet those needs, wrapped around learning and learner support. So when you're planning a study program, you're not planning a qualification. You're planning all of those different aspects of it. Now, if that program delivers the destination that the learner, or the clear purpose that the learner had, and it's been tailored appropriately, then at the end point, you'll have your career advice information, you'll have the attainment in progress, and the person will be hopefully progressing to that route that they had, or if they changed it halfway, and then that will contribute to your Key Stage 5 measures in terms of attainment, achievement, qualifications, as well as progression. So it is, and that's no different from planning a level 3 study program, but I think the emphasis there very much on making that purpose absolutely clear and agreeing that purpose with the learner. When you put those elements together, They should be combined to provide stretch and challenge for the student, and obviously meet the requirements of the new inspection framework, but also to keep in line that preparation for employment or further study. So for example, if your core learning aim is, for example, a level 2 diploma in health and fitness, we know why that's been chosen, why that's been selected, why that learner's on it. But of course, we've also got to plan the English, the maths, if they need that for the progression. Digital skills, of course, now increasingly, because that's being obviously added as an adult entitlement, but it's good to be doing that with our study program students. We have the enrichment program, the tutorial program, the work placement or industry placement, and wrapped in around that is the careers education information advice. So it's the holistic offer that is the distinction between a level 2 qual and a level 2 study program. And it's the level 2 study program, in the words of Alison Wolfe, that enables those learners to progress. It's not just a core learning aim, it's the whole wrap round. And that's what you're planning for. So when you look at the effective planning, and this to some extent is just summing up some of those things, it's saying that first of all, you've got to understand that when you've got large numbers of 16 to 18 presenting themselves to you at key stage 4 or before key stage 4, there will already be a fairly well identified demand for level 2 programs. Those learners who maybe are not going to get the GCSEs they need, those learners that are looking for a vocational technical route. So you can start to identify the numbers and types of learners, their individual needs, their motives and their expectations. And we obviously, are doing that before they actually leave key stage 4 as part of our school links, as part of our key activities with the careers company, etc., as well as with the local authority. And then I think for each individual, it's important that the coordination of the level 2 program brings all those bits to those components that we showed you earlier, as well as making sure that we induct and initially assess the learner, make sure they all have their own personal development plan. Now, these would be all characteristics that you would expect an inspector to ask you about when they're looking at that area of learning and looking at what is your intention, what's your implementation, and what's its impact. But I think the other thing is to make sure that wrap round includes the planning of the maths, the English, the digital, and the employability skills, not just the core learning aim, if that be, say, catering, hospitality, or fitness. And then, of course, I think the critical bit, the fall down where many of us have had problems with level 2 study programs, is making sure that the work placement is then planned from the beginning. And it's one of the drivers for the study program, particularly if that learner is looking for progression to employment or to an apprenticeship. So again, the work experience must be relevant, high quality, all the conditions that the new framework lays down, as well as obviously as part of your meeting the needs of the Gatsby benchmarks. And I think then we can see that ongoing support, progress monitoring, attainment monitoring is built in. But I think now with the new FE and skills environment, that we've got to make sure that the digital curriculum content and resources are effectively planned as well. I don't see us moving back from this new reality. I think increasingly for level 2 learners, there will be a bigger proportion, and it will depend on each learner, of remote and online learning. And therefore that content and resources has got to be effectively planned as well as classroom based. And then how do we optimize all those outcomes in terms of the academic and pastoral support? So I can see all of those bits plus your careers and enterprise activity built into program. And I think that means that even within level 2, there could be those level learners who are on the cusp between level 1 and 2, those who might be just in the throes of level 2 to 3. Could you actually therefore into a level 2 study program introduce some level 1 units, which might occur with the functional skills or units, as well as some level 3 for stretch and challenge. And I think that is the sort of core of the planning process that I think we are all, and seeing those level 2 learners as having quite a diverse set of needs and therefore tailoring it around those. And I think, if anything, the COVID crisis has really highlighted how important that tailoring is. So in terms of the logistics, in terms of efficiency, and I picked up a question there. Yeah, I mean, the problem about coordinating level 2 study programs is if it's just left to a curriculum area to think about their bit, which is the core, it doesn't see the learner in that holistic way. And I think from our early days of introducing study programs to now, things have changed very dramatically. We now have much more coordination between the pastoral, the academic, between the careers, etc. So that's a more integrated package. But it does need that you need to have that constant oversight of what's happening to the individual learner underneath all of this. And underneath all of this, from the efficiency point of view, is the allocation of hours between different activities. How much do we give to the core learning aim? How much do we give to English and maths, enrichment, tutorial? These are all very important decisions that have to reflect the needs of that individual learner. They must all be planned, timetabled, and organized. And a word of warning, including your remote learning. From now on, think about that as just another aspect of the planned hours of activity. Now, the audit evidence, well, I gave you some sources to look at, but it's something to obviously discuss with your MI team. The second aspect is, so I've worked out the hours. So this learner's got 600 hours, this learner's got 570, this one's got 580, this one's got 610. They've all got different hours. Why? Because they might be doing the same core learning aim, but they might have different English and maths requirements. They might have different requirements for work experience. They might have different enrichment activities. And then we need to look at the cost of each one of those. How much is the face-to-face learning costing us? How much is the remote learning costing us? For all aspects of the program, and for example, what different types of staff, who's doing the delivery of English and maths, the core learning aim, are we using different types of staff for different activities? How big is our class sizes? Are we allowing options? All of these come in to the determination of what's efficient, as well as meeting the condition of funding. In other words, which English and maths qualification is each person doing if they haven't already attained level 4 to 9, and how do we resource and timetable those? And that might be done by the English and maths team, but how does that fit with the core learning team, the curriculum area, to make sure that they're being approached in an integrated, holistic way, as well as all of the other wrap round. How many hours are we given to tutorial? How many hours are we given to half-termly reviews? And how many hours are we given to individuals who might need support with learning support, if they're dyslexia or a disability, or for those learners that need to be challenged to maybe achieve higher grades, what we're doing for them, as well as those learners who might need additional support in terms of help with English and maths, for example, those that you're doing that small group stuff. So I think it's important to look at this, because if you look in the new guidance, there are some issues here about virtual and distance learning as part of study programs, because I think there will be an element that will continue even after COVID. So I think the planned hours must be realistic and deliverable for each individual student, and you must have evidence of this for funding auditors. So in you're trying to get an efficient model, I think it's important you also meet the needs of what do you call it, audit. So in terms of cost effective, not just in terms of efficiency, but effectiveness, what's the outcomes, what's the impacts, key aspect of the inspection framework. We've also got to focus on, well, are we meeting the needs of local and national employers in terms of giving the learners access to further training and apprenticeships in the right sectors? That means the programs will have to be much more personalized and individualized. And I was asking a study program coordinator in a large institution recently, I said, how many learners have you got? He said 4,500 on study programs. How many study programs? 4,500 a week. But we can have a different 4,500 in a few weeks. So I think that was a fairly realistic appraisal. But with all those other component parts which make it effective. So it's not just about, well, I've now got 16 on that level 2 program. It's viable. I've got the right mix of staff. But, are you getting the outcomes for the learners as an effective target setting, feedback, challenge and support? But also, if you are using a combination of different types of staff, lecturers, progress coaches, instructors, great, you might have a very efficient model. This might have brought down your unit cost significantly. It might mean now that 16 gives you a break even, but you mustn't compromise on quality. And any loss in impact or in effective teaching and learning is going to be something that is a cost of your being efficient, as well as making sure that you use the appropriate type of technology. So in your information advice and guidance on online learning and flipped lessons and assessment, I think we're going to see a big number of virtual placements. We've already implemented them with some of our learners. So what they're being given is if they can't find a work placement because of the problems that the employer has currently, the employer is setting them projects to complete. And those projects then are presented back to the employer virtually. And that's a different way of looking at some of the issues around developing those enterprise skills, developing and providing high quality industry placements. But then underpinning all of this is achieving that viable group size and contribution so that you can meet your overheads. I think implicit in all of this is a lot of issues around how well teams work internally. So how is your level 2 delivery of a sport and fitness team working with English and maths, with the tutoring, the additional needs with the work placement teams, you know, and in some cases it would be better if there was only one person doing all of that. For the learners, it might be that one person coordinating all of that, being the face of the institution to that individual learner, might be the best model. It would certainly, in this time with so much stress amongst learners and so much, you know, in terms of well-being issues, that might be a better model. But I think we've also got to understand that we've got to take account of the restrictions placed on us in terms of social distancing, bubbles, etc., which have to go into lockdown, the spread of COVID among staff and students, and obviously from our students themselves as well as employers. So if you look at an example of a level 2 study program that we're offering at the moment, there's a level 2 diploma. We've got that. That's the core learning aim. That's on which retention is determined. We've got tutorial. Some of that is group tutorial, and also 3 hours of one-to-one. Now, during the COVID, we've still continued to have group sort of web meetings, but also each learner has had a half hour every month with their individual tutor, and in some cases every 2 weeks. The work placement, well, we got some during, and we've had a few since, but the numbers have been significantly reduced. But never mind, that was what was planned. English and maths, 85 hours each. That's particularly, in this case, functional skills in English and maths. And you can see that that learner, without any more information, if they're retained to the end of the year, will have earned us 4,188 before any program cost weightings, before any factors such as what postal codes they came from, etc. Now, you might say, well, that's 650 hours. Well, we max out at 540, but there's an expectation that study programs will be an average of 600 hours. Now, this student clearly needs it because they need both English and maths, and therefore that investment, if it produces the results, will be worth it. If you look at, we've also got 16 to 18 traineeships, and here you've got some of our current learners who are doing the award in employability skills. It's not important that they do a flexible element. They can just do English and maths and the work placement, but you can see that is where we do need the work placement, and that's been through the local authority, etc. And that's the bulk of what they're doing. They're also doing, over the 18 weeks, 3 hours of English and maths. So you can see that it's a mixed program. Now, some of the English and maths has had to be delivered online. The employability skills has, but wherever possible, the work placement has been actually done with the employer. But I think the key thing is there is also to have a contingency which says, is there another way of doing the industry placement, or can we reduce that component? So it's still the single biggest component. And of course, now there is flexibility. We only need to give them 70 hours of work placement while we've got these conditions applying at the moment. But again, you can see that learner, you know, last year or next year, would still be earning us £2,827 if they were retained on the work placement and completed the work placement. By the way, even if they didn't complete the work placement, but moved on to the employer as an apprentice, then we would still earn the full rate of funding. So there are some aspects of this which you've got to see as advantages if the person secures employment with training. So in terms of efficiency, how we use this staff efficiently. I'm thinking about just the level 2 diploma here, but you can see here that when this curriculum area plans out everything, and the individual tutors put in the data for how many hours and who does it, you can see that the level 2 diploma, there's a part of it's delivered directly by a lecturer, and part which is as a group is done through a mentoring. Well, that's online mentoring. It's what we call a distance learning unit that covers 34 hours of learning, and the actual distance learning unit is there's the support from an individual mentor, as well as the actual learning that goes on through the unit. So it's a self-taught element of this program, which is giving them a good link up to what they might be doing at level 3, or when they're doing a lot of their apprenticeship online. The English and Maths is delivered face-to-face to the group. The work experience, well, it's 35 hours experience. Most of that time was with an employer, but there are 2 hours of visits from the individual mentor, which could be virtual or face-to-face. The tutorial is 34 hours in a group with what we call a learning, not a facilitator, but a learning mentor who runs all the group tutorials, but also 3 hours of one-to-one. This is like a progress coach. You might have different models, you might have different titles, but you can see that this institution is trying to lay out the different types of staff that would be there to deliver a cost efficient and effective study program at level 2. Now, so is it cost efficient? Well, what I've done is, and just to show you that, and I'm sure you've got planning tools in your institution that do that. If we just look at the diploma, so there's a level 2 diploma that's in this learning program. The provider gives it 408 hours. So what we say is that's 408 hours of a total 650. So we take it as a proportion. It basically generates 62.5% of the funding that learner earns us. The learner earns us 4,188 if they're retained to the end of the program. So the hours are roughly 62.5%. So that gives us 62.5% of that, which is 263. It's an arbitrary figure, but it basically shows us what the core learning aim generates as its share of funding. So each learner that finishes the program earns us 2,630, and each non-retained learner, there's no achievement funding built into the 16 to 18 funding program for study programs, would earn us half of that. That's 1,315. So we had 20 starters. Now I might say, well, that was a lot of starters. Yeah. However, we've got this offer, and at this level 2 offer, that's the sort of target. Of those, 18 completed, 2 non-completed. So if we'd had all 20 starters, we'd have earned 52,600, but only 18 completed. That's 18 at 2,630, 2 at 1,315, and that gives us a total earning of £49,970. Now, you can see what would happen if you only recruited 16 to that and only 15. You can just simply do that. You can have a sensitivity analysis. The cost of the teaching is, we know that there's a group teaching where they're all in a group, 374 hours. We charge that at £55 an hour. That's a direct cost of employing a full-time lecturer, including all the national insurance and pension costs. So that's 20,570. We have an instructor who does the 34 hours of distance learning with them. So they're virtually available. That's at £25. Each learner gets £100 worth of distance learning materials because they're the instructional manual. And they're available to them online. And by the way, for some of the learners, they're also available in paper form if they haven't got access to it online. And that's another £2,000. So our total direct costs are 23,420. Now that means that the difference between that and the revenue is our contribution to indirect cost. Now what's the overheads? Now that's 53%. And that is a very good contribution rate. But you can see what would happen to that contribution rate if you only had 14 starters. And of those, only 13 completed. You could do the sums. The only thing that would be affected is that you would have a slightly lower cost on the distance learning materials that you have to buy, because we buy them for the number of starters, not the number of completers. So you could see that there'll be some savings, but you would obviously have a much lower contribution rate. So, I mean, that's in a very quick way is the type of tool that would help you as a curriculum planner, program planner, to know whether your offer of a level 2 study program is cost efficient. And obviously, if you've only got 14 starters, it would put the overhead figure. Now, you might say, well, that's okay, because we've got some classes at 14 at level 2, some at 15, some at 16, and some at 20. And as long as the overall, the ones which generate a greater contribution, subsidize those with a lower contribution, you might only have an overall contribution target. Can I just ask from those of you listening in, how many of you as people who deliver and plan and deliver level 2 programs are set contribution targets for your level 2 programs. In other words, each program or your total offer of programs, say in catering, hospitality, or whatever, have got to generate an overall contribution rate. How many of you have got that sort of target, or that sort of, if you want, driver of efficiency, which is to achieve a contribution rate of whatever it is? Got a few hands going up. Yeah. Yeah. A few hands going up. Not aware we've got one. It's a good answer. Yeah. Yeah. Or it's done at the level of the manager above. Good. Good. Yeah. 45% is our target. See, again, it varies, and that's okay. It takes account of the circumstances you find. But of course, the issue for me is, it's great, but is it cost effective? And cost effective saying, well, if you had that model of efficiency, which is at 53%, well, it's a very good contribution rate, then let's have a look at the 20 students. 20 started the program, 2 withdrew, and 17 achieved the qualifications. So we had 1 fail. So therefore, we've got a retention rate of 18 over 20, which is 90%. And we have an achievement rate of 17 over 20, which is 85%. How does that compare to the national average? When you get your benchmarking data in out of ProAchieve, well, it's interesting. For that level 2, national average is 87% for retention and 83% for achievement. So in each case, it's a positive. There is a distance traveled that your learners have, which is positive compared to learners nationally. So you might say, that's quite an effective program. But you could see what happens if, for example, you had more withdrawals, you had a large number of starts, but more withdrawals and more fails, that obviously would bring you below that national average, and therefore the distance traveled would be negative. I don't use value added because it's a slightly different measure. It would be one where you wouldn't be delivering to the benchmarks. So again, the two sides of the equation, the efficiency side and the effectiveness side, have to be brought together. And that is not only an efficient study program at level 2, it's also very effective. So in the new investment announced in September, there was a bit of extra money for those offering traineeships. So that additional funding is there to boost the number of trainees. And to get you possibly to offer more traineeships, you can offer the employer £1,000 bonus. So here's a real incentive which is available. It's a maximum of 10 traineeship per employer. But we can also now offer them to level 3 learners, as well as traditionally offer them to level 1 and 2 learners. Now, our biggest recruitment, we offer traineeships, we have a lot of level 2 learners who finish a level 2 FE program who need what they call a finishing touch, and they come onto our traineeship program, and they do that for up to 18 weeks before they move on, very similar to what you saw in the previous example, and they move on to apprenticeships. Digital skills has now got to be offered. So I would think that if you're not thought about it, have a look at the opportunities now for a level 2 traineeship offer, so that you'll be taking learners with level 1 outcomes, running through a level 2 program, which can now be up to a year, and the route would be directly into an apprenticeship. So again, any thoughts here? Any of you thinking of taking on and adding a level 2 traineeship to your offer next year or this year? The additional funding's there. Yeah, we've got one hand going up. Okay, thank you. And because it's now extended to include level 3s, that might be an offer that you might give to your level 3s. It's now no more, if you can't get the big chunk of hours, the minimum's now 70 hours. So it can be with more than one employer. But the key message here is, it goes back to the planning the effective level 2 program, is that you've really got to have that line of sight to occupational standards. And that will be a real test. There's a little bit of, with that extra £1,000, which is interesting, we found it very helpful in giving the employer then paying for things like PPE equipment for the trainees, for travel, etc. And so this has actually made it more attractive to take on those trainees. And it can be now longer than 6 months. Before it was only 6 months. So again, that I think is another opportunity within your level 2 study programs. If you're not going to do it this year, think about 2020-21. But the other thing is, it's always because there's now a greater element of online learning, keep all that engagement information available should you be visited by auditors. Now, the other thing I just wanted to talk about is what I know that one of you has already asked me to explain, the high value courses. This is basically a 1 year's offer for any 18-year-old at risk of becoming a NEET. In other words, they've left college or they've left school and they can't basically get the job they've been looking because of COVID-19, because of what might be happening in that industry. So what you can offer them is a 1 year funded out of your study program funding, a level 2 or a level 3 qualification that supports them to get into the right sector, what we call the higher wage return sectors. So that could be, for example, a level 2 diploma in bricklaying or a level 2 certificate in health and social care. Depends on the individual learner. The funding will come to you as part of the allocation, as an additional amount of allocation. And there's also, yes, in response to a question, one of you, is the traineeship funded as a study program? For 16 to 18-year-old, it's funded as a study program. So that example I gave you of the total hours determining the funding is the same. So you could run traineeships inside your study programs now, if, for example, you're not using up the whole of your allocation, or if you want to then get the advantage of the planned numbers next year through the lag number effect. So, but there is some additional funding available to extra traineeship places, which would be an additional to your current allocation. And it's the same for this as well. So that answers this question as well. So would this be additional? This one also gives you a £400 uplift. So not only are you getting the funding for the individual through the study program funding, which can be up to 4,188 if they're full time, there's an additional £400 to cover the cost of putting on the additional course at short notice, recruiting the extra students, and preparing staffing and facilities. So our high value courses offer will actually start in January, because obviously we're trying to, those learners are now presenting themselves to. We've had quite a lot of school leavers, which is people that went back to school after they're getting their results and have been at the school for a few months. They're finding it's not right for them. They now want to find a job, but they haven't got the skills to get that job. There could be a big chance of them becoming NEET. So this is reflecting it. This is very similar to what you're getting for example, for those learners under the high value courses as part of your study programs. But this is just for school leavers aged 18. So this would also mean that if they, for example, leave early, in other words, you put on a level 2 program for them, a 1 year study program or a 6-month study program, and they get a job in the sector that they want to be employed in, then as long as you've got the evidence that they've taken up that employment or that apprenticeship and they've done it for so many months, you will still get all of the retention payments. So you won't lose any funding for them. This is the one where the allocation is amended to take account of your R04 data return. And there will be some funding available for enrolments later in the year. It's obviously subject to what the ESFA has got available. So I would think a good thing for you would be to start sending out information to people who left school and college last year in your area, who yet haven't found a job, who are unemployed or at risk of becoming a NEET, and say, look, we've got a really cracking, level 2 bricklaying course, or a level, you can do it. This is level 2 and 3, by the way, but we're talking here about level 2 study programs predominantly. So that would be a really good offer to put out there. So thanks for that. And I think, there would be some levers that clearly could do that. So to sum up, I think all of these drivers in study programs apply right across level 2, level 3. We've had the cuts in real terms funding and the compensation. You've got to have that link to the labour market, particularly with a line of sight to occupational standards employers. English and maths has still got to be a part of your level 2 programs. And obviously you've got to have all those elements, which will give you the quality of the curriculum that you seek to get the best inspection grades. And of course, now what we're looking for is innovative approaches, things like virtual placements, etc. So I think all of these changes will have affected the cost effectiveness of your study programs, including your level 2. And you all have different responses to it. And I think within the EIF, within the inspection, the new inspection framework, it's clear that all those things we've talked about, from high expectations, purposeful curriculum, personal development, safeguarding are all absolutely critical. And I think the concerns that we've had about study programs, particularly, and this includes level 2, have been those areas that we've flagged up: English and maths, work placements, high quality information, advice and guidance, as well as progress and attainment, and of course progression to further study. And that was all characterized by what was in that DFE data in terms of the review of qualifications. So have any of these been issues for your level 2 provision? Take that away, think about it, not today, but when you meet with the rest of your team, have any of those issues come up? Because that's exactly what Ofsted is looking for. If you've not been inspected yet, it's something to be aware of. But what is critical is the progression. The level 2 program has got to have impact. So either in terms of progression to further study, which again, by the way, doesn't have to be at level 3. In many cases, it will be a higher, but it also could be in a different sector at the same level. Or if it was part and parcel of a smaller level 2, it could be a bigger program, as well as employment and as well as apprenticeships. And that line of sight to apprenticeships, I think, is becoming increasingly important, not just in traineeships, but in all level 2 programs. So just to sum them up, how well do all the increases in the rates of funding reflecting? Because you might have had a 6 to 7% increase in funding, but that might just be catch up, and therefore you've still got issues about the viability. And will the high value and high cost have unforeseen consequences? Could we be directing people to catering, hospitality, engineering, construction? Why? Because they've now got higher cost weighting, but that isn't what I wanted to do. So there could be that issue about choice. And I think a lot of the programs have had a lot more impact on level 3. If you've got a large number of level 2 learners, then you're missing out compared to other providers who have got large numbers of level 3 or larger numbers, because there's a lot of as you saw, the support was for them. And I think we've also got to keep in mind how this is impacting on learners with special education needs and or disabilities, because I think there's a danger that in this model, we don't always have that view to those learners that have got those individual needs. And I think there's 2 last points is, if COVID-19 means that we've got more 16 to 18, then we're going to have more level 2 learners in our study programs. And I think that means now that we have to think about those numbers this year and in future, and making sure that the provision's right for them. But does that also mean we've got higher costs of supporting those learners? For example, in PPE, social distancing, equipment loans, the things we talked about. So in other words, you might have more learners, but more learners at the same cost or the same price in terms of funding, but you might have additional costs for those learners, particularly in finding them things like access to equipment as well as placements. So that's a run through some of the issues that I think that level 2 study programs pose at the moment. I hope that's been helpful. Are there any more questions, Mary?
Not that I can see. I think you've covered
any more
everything.
Questions or comments? But thanks for the questions. And if anyone wants any more information, get in touch with me directly. It's a bit difficult when you've got an hour, but I mean, if you're wanting to get back to me or ask or say engage me, then my contact details, particularly if you're thinking about doing traineeships, or if you've not thought about the splitting your level 2 programs so that you can do them, as part-time, what about the high value level 2s that you could be offering after Christmas if you've got the capacity, particularly in those areas in construction and engineering where there's going to be significant skill shortages. Okay then. Oh yeah, we've got one more question, comment.
Thanks for that, Andrew.
Thanks very much then. Thank you for that.